Everybody. We'll start with my presentation of a message, and then we'll work through Mr. Shaw and Mr. McCormick are going to deliver presentations that provide more insight and detail into significant themes or elements of the budget. Improving employee compensation and capital improvement planning and implementation are the major themes of the city manager's recommended budget for fiscal year 2020. The focus on compensation and capital reflects the guidance furnished at the Council's budget retreat and several ensuing budget-focused work sessions. Increasing compensation for municipal employees will improve the organization's ability to compete for well-qualified candidates for employment and properly acknowledge employees who have devoted themselves to substantial service to the community. Enhancing intentionality in capital planning and implementation will improve the delivery of capital projects and facilitate new investments in our community, thereby enhancing Waynesboro's ability to compete for healthy families and employers. The budget is constructed with the two themes as objectives and meets external obligations in the general fund, including funding for public education, social services, and related programs for children and families, corrections, and requiring additional funding, and corrections, each requiring additional funding in the ensuing fiscal year, in some cases, substantial additional funding. Because of the referenced increases, I regard these external obligations as significant influences, if not themes. The recommended general fund budget relies on new revenue provided by an increase in real property tax receipts of approximately $1.1 million, resulting from the general reassessment of real property, and a proposed 40 cents per $100 of valuation increase in the personal property tax rate. The proposed rate increase produces an estimated $350,000, the entirety of which is recommended for implementation of the capital improvement plan. It is important to note that, as recommended, the budget reflects a significant reduction in reliance on various fund balances, and as a result, the budget increases by only $278,000 from the current fiscal year to the next, which is approximately 0.54%. Ultimately, I seek and recommend Council's favorable consideration of key decision points that are integral to the construct of the general fund budget. 1. Maintain the real property tax rate at 90 cents. 2. Increase the personal property tax rate from $2.50 per $100 of valuation to $2.90 per $100. Affirm the 10% adjustment to pay grades, and affirm the capital funding strategy associated with the aforementioned personal property tax rate increase. Recommended measures in pursuit of City Council's goal of improving compensation for municipal employees include increase entry and max points on all grades by 10%, provide a 3% merit opportunity for all full-time classified municipal employees, and fund up to a 13% increase in health insurance premiums. Periodic survey and organizational experience recruiting employees indicate that the city is trailing significantly the prevailing wage and salary rates in the region and immediate labor market. The resulting competitive disadvantage is evident in nearly all recruitments undertaken and in exit interview data collected by the Human Resources Department. The wage and salary lag has been especially apparent in public works and public safety positions, including telecommunication and building safety, but prevalent as well in general labor, managerial, and director-level leadership positions. Applications are down in nearly every job classification in the municipal organization. Compensation is but one criterion on which employees and applicants derive satisfaction. However, it is first and primary consideration for typical applicants. While many local government organizations and employers generally are challenged to attract sufficient applicants for positions, it is especially detrimental for our organization to start from such a known disadvantaged position in an already difficult labor market. The three measures identified above, and beginning with the 10% adjustment to the pay grades, improve competitiveness for entry employees and enhance appreciation for employees who have dedicated a career in service to our community or are concluding a career in public service in our organization. It should be noted that strengthening the city's ability to attract and retain well-qualified employees has both immediate and longer-term implications. My experience is that attrition creates a persistent drag on an organization and limits organizational performance. Knowledgeable and experienced organizational depth is essential for developing leadership and succession planning, which insulates the organization and community from damaging impacts of attrition with an undeveloped pool of qualified successors. Further, suppressed compensation expenses understate the cost of governmental services, making recruitment from outside organizations difficult. This measure should be regarded as a necessary initial step moving toward a market-based compensation for our employees. Staff is completing the procurement of a classification and compensation study. An ordinance appropriating funds for the study will be on an upcoming council agenda. The project schedule anticipates completion of the study in sufficient time to inform recommendations for the fiscal year 2021 budget. Funding market corrections will require increased revenue and commitment by the council to stay the course and implement any identified solution. The budget contains sufficient funds for a 3% merit opportunity for employees. While the 3% increase would be the largest in a decade, such an increase does not close existing wage and salary gaps with most immediate neighboring localities which have provided 3% increases consistently in recent history. Based on initial forecasts, staff anticipates an increase to health insurance premiums of 13% or possibly higher. Coverage for a 13% increase in premium expense is provided in the recommended budget. In the face of such an increase, I would typically recommend a plan for cost sharing with employees. However, as previously stated, the 3% merit opportunity is a valued component of the budget, and I recommend that we make every effort to preserve the full value of the increase. Cost sharing with employees erodes the positive benefit of the raise, but will be necessary should the actual increase exceed 13%. In recent years, favorable claims experiences produce modest increases to premiums which have been borne entirely by the employer. The city continues to evaluate and implement cost containment measures for the benefit of the group. Recommended measures in pursuit of the goal of improving capital planning and implementation. The budget reflects several measures which I believe will enhance our organization's ability to plan and deliver capital projects, also a stated goal generally of the council. First, an improved plan. At the March 18th work session, council received a presentation of a newly organized and formatted capital improvement plan. It includes projects that have been identified and prioritized by the council, projects identified by staff, required facility maintenance, and projects identified through the comprehensive plan. It is expected as well that school construction and renovation projects are and will continue to be included in the plan. Second, the proposal to increase the personal property tax to $2.90 with the $350,000 marginal increase in revenue dedicated to fund the capital plan, providing a predictable funding mechanism to deliver and plan projects more certainly. Finally, an intentional reduced reliance on fund balance for equipment replacement, small and medium capital needs. Careful and sound management have positioned the city on solid financial footing. However, the current approach to fund balance utilization and replenishment relies too heavily on good fortune and various intended and unintended consequences of submarket wage and salary rates. The plan, and more essentially the dedicated revenue coupled with some policy work, will move the city toward even healthier practices and position and reflect commonly recognized best practices among choice cities. While our organization has accomplished significant and valuable capital investment in the last decade, there remain projects that we as a community must do to sustain service levels and projects that we may choose to do to enhance the quality of life and compete for citizens and businesses. Improvement to capital investment in our community requires a revenue commitment that is reliable and of known value. I think a fair balance has been struck between movement toward improvement and recognizing that fee and tax increases should not be treated cavalierly. Likewise, I would discourage a similar cavalier view that any meaningful improvement in compensation or capital investment can be optimistically considered absent a concurrent willingness to approve well-justified recommendations to increase revenues. In my experienced estimation, we deliver a solid value for the various taxes and fees the local government imposes. Affordability has been a recognizable characteristic of our community. It is apparent to me, and I would hope apparent to the members of council, that we need to do better by the women and men who work in this organization, and I assert that the tax and fee recommendations contained in the budget are reasonable and, if enacted, would not erode the reputation as an affordable community in which to live. Moreover, the increases would produce appreciable improvement to the ability to deliver strategic improvements to our community. It is noted that as the numbers go, with limited exception, the most significant and detectable changes from the current year to the next occur in the areas of compensation and benefits and the reliance on fund balance. Departmental non-salary and wage operating expenses remain flat or are reduced. I offer my thanks to Mr. Shaw, Mr. McCormick, and Ms. King for their service on what we regard as the Budget Committee. I extend gratitude as well to our department directors for their leadership and participation in the production of this recommended budget. More importantly, I extend sincere gratitude to our workforce broadly who convert the plan into action for the benefit of the citizens and visitors in our community. My sincere thanks to the council as well for your commitment to service to our community and your participation in the process thus far. My objective here has been to focus attention on the most substantial and impactful components of the general fund. Local government differs from state government in that budget construction is accomplished with the executive and legislative leadership working in tandem. As such, the council is not assigned responsibility to develop a budget independent of the executive, but is rather tasked with responding to the city manager's recommendation, judging alignment with commonly shared and articulated goals. As such, it is not expected the council will necessarily know how every dollar is spent, but rather will whether the budget itself pursues and accomplishes commonly shared objectives. If the council is unable to confirm alignment with objectives and comfort with revenue recommendations presented this evening, staff needs to know as soon as possible, if not immediately, and set about a plan to revise the fundamental construct of the budget. Mr. Shaw and Mr. McCormick will provide some additional detail into key budgetary components.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp. Mr. Mayor, members of council. As Mr. Hamp says, Mr. McCormick and I would like to walk the council through budget highlights. I would like to begin with comments on priorities and some insight into our proposal to increase revenues. And then Mr. McCormick will work through the budget detail, including a discussion of the capital improvement plan, and then some of the next steps in our process. As we discussed in the last budget work session, we're proposing to make some significant changes in the way that we approach capital planning and funding, and that has implications for the way that the council will adopt a budget and appropriate funds this year. And so we want to make sure that the council's aware of what some of those differences are, and in fact, pretty soon we'll point you towards the appropriation ordinances for the operating budget and the capital budget. And then as well, some of the things that we've done this year to construct the budget are different than things we've done in the past, and a lot of that is in response to the demand for a more robust capital improvement plan. And so, for instance, the use of fund balance, while we still propose the use of fund balance, I think we recognize that you can't continue to buy police cars and do basic building maintenance, buy computers and that sort of thing with your fund balance, and then have enough money to do what we would consider true capital projects. So there's some things there that are done differently. There's some things that are done with debt service that are a little different. And we just want to make sure the council's apprised and aware of what you're being asked to do. With that in mind, I think during the budget season here, we would like to focus some attention on policies related to debt and policies related to capital improvement. Much as we've focused attention on policies related to fund balance in the past, they serve councils well over time, and those are policies of the council, but it gives you, some guidance in terms of how you justify, prioritize, and fund large capital projects. And while you can change your policies, any council can decide to revise policies, at least you have to have a discussion to do that. At least you have to have votes to revise the basic operating procedure. So again, we'd like to focus some attention in that area. I try to start with something that's somewhat aspirational and hopefully motivating. The budget is the financial center of gravity for the local government, and so all of the city's programs, projects, services, no matter how routine or mundane or how aspirational, have to find their place in the budget. And so the budget contains some great combinations of things that the local government must do according to mandate, that there are things that we do because we've taken responsibility for managing a wastewater treatment system or a water treatment system or a road system or wherever it may be, and that there are mandates that direct us how that is to be done. And there are things that we assume as responsibilities, that we assume the responsibility of funding a public school system. And then there are those things that you want to do because the council, the staff, has some sense that these are the shared aspirations of our community. But the budget is always some combination of things that are, I liken to when you do home improvement. Some things are fixing your roof and some things are building the deck. I hope by now this is a list that's familiar to you. We've tried to make every effort to be mindful of the priorities that the council established in its budget retreat in December. Given our revenue resources, I think it's difficult to pursue each of these priorities probably as aggressively as any of us would like, but I think we tried to make these the top priority, and I hope that as you work through these, we would be able to point to things in the budget and say, well, at least those things at the top of your list, there should be clearly an effort to address your priorities. Compensation and capital tend to be a big theme, as Mr. Hamp has pointed out, of this particular budget. And I think that when you consider compensation or when you consider capital improvement, large capital investment, you have to start to think about budgets in more than one budget cycle, because when you give employees raises, then you've automatically passed that growth in your budget into the next year, barring some sort of a dramatic reversal, downsizing of staff or something of that nature. And then similarly with capital, the local government simply can't generate enough money in one fiscal year to pursue some of these projects. So you have to be willing, and the city councils have done a good job, I think, of either timing borrowing or setting aside funds so that you're saving up enough to pursue capital with cash. So I think that where we have been, if I was to editorialize a bit, we're looking to this council as you have indicated to us your priorities, then to say, here's how we as professionals give you some roadmap to accomplishment. That we basically feel like we're in alignment. I think the council, as I look at your priority list, I think those are the priorities of the staff, and we think we're in alignment. But now we're going to have to be willing to say, here is how those things are accomplished in the context of local government management. And that's not always easy. If I were to editorialize, I think over the last decade or so, we worked for councils who set priorities of keeping a very low tax rate, of having Waynesboro be an exceptionally affordable community, and basically limiting the role of government and trying to operate a small and conservative government. And I wouldn't ask them apologize for that. I don't apologize for my service to the last decade to those councils. But really, to do that, you have to make a great scrutiny of expenditures. And as you start to look at your organization, your business model, well, we're very labor intensive. And so you have to do what you can to try to suppress the growth of your labor cost. And that's just a business model. I'm not making that as any kind of a judgment, but it's just the way you do business. And then in terms of capital, you have to really confine your capital investment to basic infrastructure. And I would say in the last decade, the city of Waynesboro, and we can look at this and prove it, has invested more in basic infrastructure than had been in previous decades in terms of water lines, sewage treatment plants, water plant, stormwater projects, bridges, the basic infrastructure of government. A lot of that cost is borne in the enterprises, and the enterprises are functioning well, they're self-supporting. We need to push the stormwater program a little more in that direction. And so the rates are carrying a lot of that infrastructure cost. So those councils, gave us their priorities, and we were very deliberate in the way we executed them. I don't know if it's too strong to say that we're at a sea change. I do know that those councils faced their own challenges. That council had to live through a recession. Those councils had to take on mandates like MS4 and respond to an unfunded mandate, federal mandate there. This council's facing one of the toughest labor markets that the nation has seen in decades. That's the reality that's foisted upon you. And so as we went through a period of trying to keep our wage low in comparison, well, now we're really stung in the market. We found ourselves behind. And so that's a situation that this council, like it or not, we're having to address. I think as well, we are very well poised. We're in a good position financially because the councils were conservative in the use of funds, and to be able to do some things and to make some investments in the community. And I think where we are in the regional economy puts us in a good position to do those things if we're willing to do it. If that's what the council wants to do, then I think you're in a good position to step forward. You've been left with a good base to work from. One of the issues that was identified as part of the comprehensive plan process, the 2018 comp plan, was that the city is pretty vulnerable in terms of where our revenue comes from, that our finances are based or have a high dependence on revenues like the sales tax, meals tax, lodging tax, that are fairly vulnerable to market and to the general economy. And so what you typically find among Virginia communities, cities especially, that the average Virginia city generates about 45% of its total general fund money from the real estate tax. And we generate about 30%, a little less than 30%. And then if you take all of the general taxes, all general property taxes, then that average for Virginia cities goes up to almost 60%, about 57%. And we're a bit more than 45. So I think what ends up being the case, and I use the cautionary tale of what happened to Waynesboro with machinery and tools tax, that years ago the city was generating about $5 million a year, and these were $1990 in machinery and tools tax. And then with the decline of major industries here, that number dropped to less than $1 million. At about the same time, our sales tax was around $1 million, and then you had Walmart and the expansion of all of the retailing around the interstate interchange, and our meals tax goes to about $5 million. Our sales tax goes to about $5 million. And so now the general economy, folks who are watching the retail industry are telling us that there's this retail apocalypse that's going to happen, that the brick and mortar stores are being heavily challenged by online shopping and different consumer patterns. And so during the comp plan, I think there was this discussion and this recognition that we've got to do something to shift our reliance on those vulnerable resources to something more stable. And the real estate tax tends to be the workhorse of local government funding. It's more dependable, it's stable, it's easy to assess, easy to administer, and compliance is easy. Now, having said that, it's wildly unpopular that, folks have some objection to paying taxes. And so we don't minimize the dilemma that the council is in, or we're in trying to shift, reliance from things like meals and sales tax and more to real estate tax. It's not something I think you can do in a single budget season. So as Mr. Hamp has stated, we would propose, and we've said this to council, I think, consistently, to have the real estate tax remain at 90 cents per $100 evaluation, to have personal property tax rate increase from $2.50 to $2.90 per $100 evaluation. We would have the stormwater utility fee increase from $3.42 per ERU, that's the equivalent residential unit, or what the typical homeowner pays a month for their stormwater fee. It's also equates to a 1,600 square feet value that's charged to non-residential users. And then finally, based on our 2017 water and sewer rate study, we would suggest that water and sewer usage and base fees be increased by 1.1%. And as I think we've discussed in the past, in comparison, Waynesboro has quite a low real estate tax as compared to other Virginia cities. That among 38 Virginia cities, we're tied for 30th lowest in terms of our real estate tax rate. Currently, the median real estate tax rate for Virginia cities is $1.07, and the unweighted average among cities is $1.05. So certainly affordable in comparison. And I would also say, if you look at the statewide average housing generally here in Waynesboro and the Valley generally is quite affordable. Similarly, Waynesboro is one of the least taxed, or has one of the lowest personal property tax rates in the Commonwealth among Virginia cities, that at $2.50 we're quite a bit below the median or averages of $3.75 or $3.78 per $100 of value, and we rank 34th among 38 cities in terms of our personal property tax rate. The stormwater utility fee is a little harder to compare because there isn't as great a consistency about the way that stormwater fees are assessed across the Commonwealth. And then as well, what you find is that the stormwater utility fee is most common in communities that have been designated as MS4 communities, or have the municipal stormwater sewer systems that are regulated under federal law. And in that regard, what you would find is the median for ERU per ERU for the communities that have fees is about $6. Ours is currently $3.42. The average is a bit higher at $7.12, and we rank 16th among 18 Virginia communities in terms of our the ERU rate. In terms of why we would suggest to you that we would raise any of these rates, I would say first, as we went through the budget, that we make some assumption that we're going to have to live within the means of the current rate structure, because we don't have the authority as staff to raise rates. And so we'll start with the assumption that rates are going to have to stay the same. But then if we get to the point where we say we can't either accomplish the things that the council said we want to accomplish, or that there are things that we believe that need to be accomplished that are the priorities of the administration and professional staff, then we come to you with some sort of a proposal to increase revenue. And so I think, again, not to belabor the point, but when you look at trying to give our labor force a 3% increase and raise the pay scales by 10%, top and bottom, and that's a $350,000 investment. And then if we look towards actually setting aside money for capital planning, if we look at the other priorities that have come to us, increased jail spending, all those things, we say we simply don't generate enough money to do all of these things. And the fallback position, again, is to cut your labor cost or to cut capital expenditures or to use fund balance to fund those recurrent capital expenditures like vehicles. And so that's where I think we certainly find ourselves today, is that without generating those additional dollars, if you say we're not going to do that, then we're going to have to go back and reduce our budget, and those are the places you go, because there's not a bunch else. If you start to look at the money that you generate with your tax-supported dollars, about half of it goes to somebody else. It goes to the school system, it goes to the Department of Social Services, it goes to a regional jail operation, it goes to debt. And then you start to look at what's left there, and you have a big chunk that is VDOT money that you're going to spend, you can only spend on road maintenance. And then you start to look at public safety. And so how much can you squeeze there? That, again, a lot of that cost is labor, and that if you examine closely the budgets, you're going to see that in a lot of the other operational costs, this year they're either flat or slight increases or slight decreases. And so I think we get to the point where we say, if these are the things that are priorities to you, then it costs something, and that the citizenry who enjoys the benefit of those services, fortunately, unfortunately, the way the system works is the local folks have to pay for those services. We've done recent rate studies in the stormwater utility enterprise. We created the utility in 2016. It has been self-supporting, but for debt service, that there were bonds that were issued for large capital projects that have continued to reside in the general fund, and that's about $275,000. And so the way that it works is that you have these assets that reside in the stormwater fund, and that there's a subsidy from the general fund to pay for their debt. And so this would move the debt, allow that you could move your debt service for stormwater capital into the stormwater fund, where it should reside at any case. But as we looked at what we will need to do in terms of capital replacement, that most of the stormwater heavy equipment, maintenance equipment now, was purchased in 2007, 2008. So we're getting to a point where we're needing to replace heavy equipment. We take debt service on, if we look at increasing labor cost in the stormwater enterprises, and then as well the increases that are forced by compliance under the MS4 regulation, that I think you've seen Mr. McCrae's presentation. He gives the annual update, that we have to basically abide by a variety of pollution control measures, minimum pollution control measures, by virtue of holding this permit. And they're very specific activities that we have to take on, and they increase over time. So looking at the next 5 years, what we see is that the stormwater program will start to run a deficit, and that eventually the enterprise will no longer be self-supporting. We would expect that once you get to 2024 and we're in a new permit cycle, things could become even more expensive. So we're proposing now to do a 15% increase this year, and then you can expect that we propose another 15% increase next year, and then by 2024 you would probably look at another rate increase. Hopefully it would be more modest than that. But just to look at what we've done, this is the current revenue projection, and we're conservative. We realize that there will be additional impervious surface that comes online over time, but those tend to be fairly small increases. These are expenses, and you see a pretty big jump proposed in 2020. A lot of that is moving debt service, again, about $275,000 of debt service into the fund, and then we begin replacing capital equipment and doing small capital projects in the fund. Retained earnings is listed on this line. The current retained earnings in the fund is about $720,000. The required retained earnings, that is the 2 months of operating cash that we need to hold in the fund, is listed here. So what you can see is that over time, if the expenditures exceed the revenue in the fund, then you have a reduction in your retained earnings. And so in 2020, you can absorb that, but you pretty soon start to run such a big deficit that by the year 2022, you basically are running the fund at a deficit and would have to subsidize it. You've exhausted the retained earnings that are required to be held in the fund, and you're not able to meet your expenditures as required with revenue. So with a 15% increase, you still would start to operate in the current fiscal year at some deficit, but you can see the reduction in retained earnings is a lot less significant. And so the retained earnings by 2021 are still reduced, but they're held well above what would be required, and the same would be true for 2022. So the 15% buys you some time. It doesn't fix your problem, but it certainly buys you some time. And that's the reason that we propose to do this over a 2-year period. Again, I think the water and sewer enterprises really are a good model for how an enterprise ought to work. They're self-funded, self-sustaining, and they, in recent years, what we've attempted to do through rate study is basically look at what are the capital needs, what are the operational needs, what are the debt service needs of the funds, and then let's match rates, what are regulatory compliance demands on these funds. And so we match rates. And what occurs is that the rate increases, since we've done the rate study, tend to be more modest than in past years, where you would go for years without a rate increase, and then you would see a big leap. And some of them were very significant because we were taking on tremendous amounts of debt. You borrow money to build a water treatment facility or wastewater treatment facility. That's going to push a really significant rate increase. Especially in the sewer fund, I think over time we've been able to develop a relationship with the Department of Environmental Quality, where now we're operating our I&I compliance standards, I think pretty much at a maintenance program, and we will get through the 5-year rate study period without having to take on additional debt. But we are looking at, in the water fund, again, a rate increase about 1.1%. According to the rate study, the sewer fund would likewise be 1.1% increase in facility and usage fees. The impact then for the typical homeowner, a typical residential unit uses a 5/8 inch meter, uses about 10,000 gallons of water on a bi-monthly basis. So the increase in the bill, total increase for water and sewer, would be a little less than $2 per billing cycle. So, over a period of a year, I'm not sure the math is correct here. It would be about, that's right, it would be a little less than $12 a year. So, at any rate, that would be the impact on a typical homeowner. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. McCormick to talk a bit about the budget itself, the budget calendar, and then ultimately the capital plan and steps.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. So I'm going to take a bit of time and walk you through the highlights of the budget book. I tried to keep it at a level of about $100,000 change from the previous year. And then I'll also walk you through some of the things that were cut that were new departmental requests this year as well. So hopefully you'll see many of the same themes as we have discussed in our earlier budget work session. My goal for this presentation are to make sure that you all have a firm understanding of the city manager's recommended budget and the changes from last year, give you a roadmap with next steps necessary for budget adoption, and hopefully give you enough information so that we can create some topics for our remaining 2 budget work sessions. So let's start with the budget calendar, which is on page 3. So we're still on pace to adopt on at your May 28th meeting. We have 2 more budget work sessions scheduled, one next Tuesday at 9 a.m. and one the following Wednesday at 5 p.m. The effective tax rate increase was advertised on March 22nd, and you will hold your public hearing on that at your second meeting in April. We're planning to do things just a bit different this year with regards to the ordinance introduction. We will ask that you introduce your ordinance at the April 22nd meeting and call for a public hearing at the next meeting. Between the April 22nd meeting and the May 13th meeting, we will advertise the hearing. The hearing will be held on May 13th, and then you will adopt the ordinance at the May 28th meeting. So once the budget is introduced and advertised, the rates and budget cannot be increased. However, they could be decreased if council wishes. So moving ahead to page 8 of the budget book, so I'm skipping over some of the summary items and pages because I will touch on everything discussed there as we work through the detail. So there are a few things on this page I would like for you all to take note of, the first of which being the year-over-year increase in real property tax. This is almost entirely due to the increase in assessments, which went up on average about 7%. The next item is the second line, an increase in personal property tax. As we have discussed and recommended, there is a proposed increase in motor vehicles tax. Without that increase, you would actually see a pretty large decrease in this line. This is due to the decrease in machinery and tools as well as the decrease in your business personal property base. It's partially caused by a rather large business electing to be advertised or taxed as a public service corp, and that also accounts for the increase in the line that's other local taxes, and partially because those tax bases are just continuing to decrease year over year. So as you go down the page, everything's relatively flat. The decrease in the state non-categorical aid is offset mostly by the increase in federal categorical. This was just a shift of the victim witness monies that we have always done as an audit adjustment to correct at the end of the year. We just moved it from the state money down to the federal money from the beginning. There's no real change in funding source there. The $98,000 increase in the categorical section is due to the increase in street maintenance funding. The last thing I'd like to do is point out the decrease in the transfer from other funds and the use of surplus. So during prior years, we transferred some monies in to pay for some breathing apparatuses from the capital fund and used fund balance monies to pay for a few rolling stock type items like police cars. This year, we do not need to purchase the breathing apparatus, and we have found a way to work 3 police cars into the operating budget, as well as purchase a mower with the operating budget. And we will be bringing an appropriation from last year's monies to purchase 1 used truck for Parks and Recreation. So all of that results in an increase into the budget of about $278,000, or less than 1%. So the next few pages have some graphs that show the revenue broken down in a few different ways. As you can see, most of our revenue comes from local sources, and those local sources are mostly real property taxes. Our hope as staff would be to continue transitioning the city to being more dependent on the real property tax, as that is one of your more stable revenue sources. So that wraps up everything that's noteworthy about about revenues. So now if you guys could skip on to page 26. I'd like to talk through some of the changes in the general fund expenditures by category. So the large increase in salary and wages is due to 3 things. The increase in the salary scales of 10%, which, keep in mind, this does not mean that everyone gets 10% salary increase. It just means that we are moving the scales. If you're within 10% of the bottom of your pay range, you would get moved up to the new floor of the range. It will also allow employees at the top end of the range some additional growth opportunity during the raises. The second reason for the increase in this line is a 3% raise that's projected to start during October. And the third reason is that since we deferred our raise a few months in the prior year, during last year's budget cycle, we have to pay for the full amount during this year, which causes a year-over-year increase. And then as a side note, at staff, we're almost always in favor of doing a larger percentage raise and delaying it into the year versus doing a smaller percentage raise at the beginning. And the reason for that's twofold. It shows a commitment to trying to push salaries higher and is more beneficial for employees' VRS payouts because it increases their base salary more than doing a smaller percent at the beginning of the year. Okay. And then the second increase I would like to point out is the fringe benefit increase. So our consultants are predicting around a 17% increase in insurance. With some simple plan changes, we can decrease that to about 13.1, which is what we budgeted for. This increase will allow us to pay for both employer and employee portions of that increase, hopefully meaning we have little to pass on to the employees. So purchased services decreased for a few different reasons. One, we did some gas remediation at Sunset Park during this year that doesn't need to be repeated during 2020. That accounted for about $120,000, and we decreased building and grounds repairs by about $120,000. We will do some similar repairs to the ones we did in building and grounds during the CIP process. We also decreased the budget for paving by about $281,000. And so if you look back at page 25, you'll notice that the total public works VDOT section increased a little over $136,000 during the year. The reason for that is we have a section of streetlights on East Main and South Delphine that will need to be replaced in the next few years. Our hope is to get some RDOT revenue sharing funding to construct a roundabout. However, if the need rises quicker to replace those, we can use highway maintenance replacement monies to correct any issues. So then as the year progresses, if it becomes apparent that we're not going to need those monies, we'll slide that back into the paving to make sure that we meet all of our street maintenance requirements. So the next big change is on major purchases of non-capital. We had a few large items that made this up. All of them were around $30,000. There's some non-capital related fire equipment that were necessary for the breathing apparatuses, e-citation policeman department software, and then there's a small cut to the police department, capital computer hardware, and then a one-time purchase to replace electronic poll books for the registrar. Joint operations went down due to moving the capital portion of the jail expenditure and the capital portion of the juvenile detention center to the CIP plan, which we will discuss in further detail when we get to the CIP plan. And then non-departmental expenditures have a number of things going different ways, but the main changes are an increase in the transfer to the CIP fund of the $350,000 for the personal property tax increase, an increase in social services of $150,000, increase in local school support of about $127,000, and then a decrease in debt for the movement of the debt to the stormwater fund of about $275,000. So those are pretty much all the major changes in the general fund expenditures and revenues. There are some things that were requested at the department level that were not in last year's budget and that also didn't make it into this year's budget. They were basically 6 new positions for the fire department and some supplemental raises for police department positions, which were 3 officers and 1 animal control, and supplemental raises. An administrative assistant that was scheduled to be split between the EOC department and the information technology department, a marketing communications manager for an economic development, an assistant registrar, 3 take-home police vehicles, and the downtown redevelopment fund. It's worth noting on the positions, we didn't fund any new full-time positions during this year's budget cycle. I think we funded 1 or 2 part-time positions, but no new full-time positions. Sorry, in the general fund. Okay, so then the general fund issues for next year. So raises are going to begin in October this year, so we'll have to find the first or pick up the first 2-3 months of expenditure for that during your 2021 budget. The insurance increase, the way that our plan works, it starts on January 1, so the 13.1% increase starts on January 1 as well, so we'll have to find the first half for the 2021. The stormwater debt funding, which Mr. Shaw alluded to, part of it will be covered by the 15% increase this year, and then part of it by the 15% increase next year. So that should take care of itself if we follow through with the rate study. And then the regular debt funding, you guys were about a penny short on the tax rate, so about $200,000 when we went into the high school debt. We have that money in reserve, and we can use it to pay for it for 1 year, and then we have a literary fund loan that's falling off. It fully amortizes during next year, so it'll come off the amortization schedule, and we can just replace that debt. So all of those items have a plan to be brought to full term for next year. Okay, so if we could switch to the CIP plan for just a second. Okay, so this is the proposed CIP plan for 2020. This is the one that the appropriations will actually be in this year's budget for. The main things on the CIP plan to focus on are the first and the second year. They're pretty rigid, and then when you get into years 3, 4, and 5, it gets into more of a planning mechanism to try and get your project scheduled out so you can start to time debt and things like that if you need to take on any new debt. So if you'll over on about the third column, you have whether the item is an outlay or reserve. So outlay just means that as soon as you make the appropriation this year, not as soon, but shortly after you make the appropriation this year, the funds will be encumbered and spent before the end of the next year. The reserve is just putting money away for future years for an item that we know is coming up. So like, for example, the Middle River Regional Jail Reserve, the $340,000 on the first line, that's our portion of capital or for the debt payment at the Middle River Regional Jail for when the jail was originally built. The second portion, that payment lasts for about 13 years. So the second portion, if we save the next 4 or 5 years of the regional debt reserve, the second portion will go to pay for the next 5, 6 years. So that'll get you through 2028, 2029 debt service on the regional jail. The juvenile detention center debt service, that's an outlay. Greenway Phase 2B, that's your quality of life project number 4. It's $420,000. That's an outlay. Greenway Phase, sorry, does that say 2 or 3? Greenway Phase 3. I'm sorry, I lost my spot. That's $1 million. That's a quality of life project, and that's actually grant funded from open container funds. Then we're setting up a reserve so that to start Sunset Park, so $851,000, and that'll be fully funded during 2021. Social services roof project, and then the heating and air conditioning for the Gorsuch building. Those are 2 projects that Dwayne has identified for Parks and Recreation that need to be done to buildings. I think that the social services roof project, the social services roof wasn't replaced when all the other roofs were replaced a number of years ago, so it's up and needs to be replaced. And then the heating and air conditioning, I think there's a group of them at the Gorsuch building that we're going around and replacing a few at a time, so that's to keep up with the maintenance on that. Then you have your first Southern Corridor payment will come due probably at the end of this year or early next year, end of 2019, beginning of 2020. This is setting money aside so that we can make that payment. Southern Corridor Reserve for payment number 2. We anticipate that payment will come due in 2023. So we're setting up a reserve because that's almost $1.5 million that we'll have to pay out during 2022, 2023 timeframe. So we want to make sure we're prepared to write the check to VDOT when they request it. And then you have some CAMA software for the assessor, and then the 13th Street and Rosser Avenue roundabout. That's an outlay, and that actually has some grant funding related to it. So any questions about the first year of the CIP fund or where any of the appropriations down at the bottom come from? Most of them are grants. There's a little bit of money that was left over from the audit from last year that was fund balance, identified as fund balance that hasn't been used yet that we can roll into the CIP fund to get everything started. And then there's some funding from your regular general fund budget of about $1,021,200 to keep it going. Okay, so then moving on to 2021, I marked this one as draft. You go back up just a little bit. Yeah, since it hasn't been approved yet and won't be appropriated this year, I went ahead and marked it as draft because this is one that can change. This is something that can change next year if there another project pops up that we want to do, or if we want to switch projects out. Again, same format, whether it's an outlay or reserve, and then where it hits on your comprehensive plan, along with the funding sources noted at the bottom. I think the local funding needed is probably pretty reasonable. The 1.6 million at the bottom of the page is pretty reasonable between your leftover fund balance that'll come during 2019 from salary savings, and then any additional monies that we can put together for appropriation from the general fund next year. And then we've went ahead and planned out 2022 through 2025, or 2022 through 2024. So basically what we did on these is we just mapped out every project that the department heads had given us. The balance needed from local funding of the 2.4, you're probably starting to get a little bit aggressive down towards the bottom on the balance needed from local funding. The thought would be that you would move some projects either into the next year or come up with a different revenue source. This also shows the Waynesboro City Schools. That's the big one for the high school phase 2, and the anticipation would be that would be funded through bond funding. And then moving on to 2023. Kind of the same deal when you go down to the balance needed from local funding. You're getting to be pretty aggressive, so we'd have to go through and pare these projects back, or find another funding source and move them to the next year, or find another funding source. But this is the year that the infrastructure priority project for the Broad Street Access Management comes together. And then we have the Museum of Natural History, which I think has a local match and a grant piece. The Juvenile Detention Center debt service is continued, and then the take-home vehicle program for police, which is also in your 2021 and 2022 plan. So that takes you to 2024. Which starts with your juvenile detention center, and then you've got continuing through with your take-home vehicle program, your jail debt and your jail debt reserve, this basic city soccer complex, Ridgeview baseball complex and lights, the Ridgeview splash park, and then a whole bunch of sidewalk pieces and streets projects, and that's at $2.8 million of local funding needed. And then the last page of the comp plan is kind of your unplanned, unfunded. This is where you put things. Like the jail's going to need to do an expansion sometime in the next probably year to 2 years. They will likely fund that with bond proceeds. This year, the reason that the jail costs went up so much during the current year is because they may have to rent beds from another locality to house some of their inmates, where in the past they've actually gotten revenues from renting beds to other localities. So the hope is that once the jail expansion project is done, you will no longer have to rent beds, and then you can take the $500,000 that you're paying to rent beds and use it towards the jail expansion towards the debt process. The Ludowit-Rosser connector for the industrial park, and then Nature's Crossing for the technology center, the grading, Waynesboro Commerce at the industrial park. Those are items that you would most likely need to fund through some type of borrowing, some type of debt funding. So until we have a plan for what we would like to do with that, that would stay on unplanned and unfunded. Okay, so if you guys could go to page 206 in the budget book. So page 206 is a suggested ordinance. Section 1 just shows the total amount of the entire budget for, that's the city, that's the schools, that's the water fund. That is everything all wrapped up into one number. Then section 3 and 4 are the tax rates that are proposed. And then flipping over to the next page, section 6 is the level at which the budget would be adopted. And then section 9 and 10 talk about how we would assess penalties on taxes when they're late, penalties and interest on taxes. And then the end on page 209 lays out when the budget would be introduced, when the public hearings would be, the public hearing date, adopted, and then the effective date. The next page, which is just incorporated by reference, is page 210. That has some detail in it. The big ones that you want to look at are the total revenues, because that's how much is appropriated in each fund. And that goes through and spells out how much is appropriated in each fund. And then there is a little bit of detail, but that's just a reference point. Okay. And then starting on page 213, we have the revised fee rate ordinance. And that shows all of the rate increases that Mr. Shaw went through. So a couple of housekeeping items. At your next meeting, we'll have a few small appropriations. We plan to appropriate some money for the HR study. We need to have a cost allocation plan performed so that we can show we can correctly show our VDOT overhead allocation. Parks and Recreation needs some money for a used truck, and the EDA needs about $9,000 to match for the facade grant program. And then we'll also have an appropriation that won't come out of fund balance. It's actually matched by revenue. We received about $100,000 more in VDOT revenue last year for 2019 than what was budgeted, so we'll offset that into the VDOT paving expenditure. And then during June, we'll be bringing you a budget amendment. So if the change of the budget's more than 1%, or funds are transferred from one fund to another, a budget amendment is required. So this amendment will move the school debt monies to a segregated debt fund for easier tracking. And then, assuming you all want to press forward with a CIP, it will move some fund balance monies to that fund, and it will also move some monies to the debt fund to fund the $200,000 shortfall this year, but the monies to the CIP fund will be used for things like the Southern Corridor project that they come due closer to the end of this year. So the next steps that we have, these are what staff sees as the next steps. We need to settle on a topic of discussion for the next two work sessions, or for the next work session, and then we also have one more after that if needed. We had hoped that we would have an in-depth discussion on policies and procedures surrounding a strong debt and CIP fund for the first half of the next budget work session. And then the second half of the work session, we could field questions from council about the city manager's proposed budget. We'll introduce your ordinance on April 22nd, or we'll bring you the ordinance to introduce on April 22nd, which is your second meeting in April. We'll hold a public hearing at the first meeting in May, and then hopefully adopt at the final meeting in May. And that is all I have.
Well, thank you very much. Very detailed. I love the new format. So look forward to reviewing our first, for those in the audience and watching. So we're getting it when you're getting it. And certainly appreciate staff's attention and efforts to develop the document in partnership. I certainly have enjoyed the process thus far, and think it's been collaborative and insightful. I know for myself, and I would hope for others. So with that, I'll open up for questions. Anybody might have thoughts?
In one of your statements, you were saying that we want to try to swing to being more dependent on our real estate tax than on our sales tax. But in doing it, we will be raising the real estate tax, and we're still getting the sales tax. And I know in the past, a gentleman sitting across the table there from me said that we've never had the problem, if we give you the money, you'll spend it. And we know that's true because there's so many needs out here that we have to address. But as time goes on and we keep raising the real estate tax, and then as the sales tax, if it happens, and it probably will, starts to decline, then as that declines, we're going to need to raise the real estate tax again to make up for where we're losing it in the sales tax. So here we are, 2 years ago to today, 10 cents on real estate tax. We're looking at 5 cents here for real estate tax. And the things that we've talked about here tonight, we're not fixing any of our real problems. And, you know, when you look in the newspaper and you see these factories running ad after ad after ad trying to get employees, paying more money than we're starting off, and they're struggling, and we do a 3% salary increase, I think that will help us, especially with our more long-term employees, keeping them. It's not going to hurt on trying to get in new ones, but it's not going to fix it. And if, you know, we did 6 cents or 6% this time, it's still not going to fix it. We're going to be working towards trying to correct it. But what I see coming down the road, I don't like what I see. I see that the tax rate is going to take a 5 cent hit here. And then when we talked about the second phase of the high school, that's going to be another hit, along with continuing to try to fix compensation for employees. But every time we turn around, as you've said, every meeting we've had, the cost of social services, the cost of jail, the cost of insurance, it continues to just keep going and going and going. When we talked about we'll be in a deficit with the stormwater fee, the only thing I could hope for is maybe Washington would say, you know what, we were just kidding about that, and y'all can quit doing that, and so take that money that you're raising and put it somewhere else. But that's probably not going to happen either, and we'll probably get more mandates that are going to say, you got to do it, and we're not going to fund it. So I just don't feel real comfortable in looking down the road at where we're going, and I see it as a necessity, and it's going to happen, whether I don't like it or do like it. But I think the people, our community, need to be totally aware of, you know, what's coming. And this year is just should be a good wake up, because you're going to get a substantial real estate tax increase. You're going to get a small personal property increase. You're going to get increases in some of our sewer and treatment. And I know what I'm going to hear when I go out and talk to people and businesses in the community. They're not going to like it, but it's just like the high school had to do it, and these are things we have to do. So it'll send a very clear message to the people of Waynesboro, this is what's coming.
Well, unfortunately, we've had years and years where we've had very low cost of living in Waynesboro, and we're starting to pay for it now because we've had to let things run down. I don't like taxes going up. I don't like to see things raised as high as they're being raised, but I also see the necessity in order to keep the city running and to keep the level of service up for all of our citizens that they expect and they've been receiving for these years. We've got to pay for it, and unfortunately, I look over the budget here, and there's really no waste in our budget. If you go through the individual agencies, it's a fair budget, and much as I don't like taxes going up, it's a necessity in order to keep the level of service, you know, that the citizens have expected from the city of Waynesboro.
Thank you.
Somewhere we got to remember too, people can only take so much.
Well, I know.
Because they still have to have money to live off of.
Then they need
all the things that we've talked about are necessities, but
they need to let us know then what they don't want. I mean, what they can live without, because everybody likes what the city provides, and that costs money. We've got city employees now that 3% is the largest pay raise they've had in a decade. That's sad when every jurisdiction around us has been raising theirs, and they recruit away from us, and they're recruiting our talent away. At some point, we've got to say enough's enough. We've got to take care of our employees. We've got to take care of our citizens in order to keep what we have. So,
In the past, every time we give or try to give an extra raise, like to the police officers, several different raises the rest of the employees didn't give. As soon as we did it, the other places raised theirs again. So
Yeah,
I don't know if we think we're going to catch up. I think we're fooling ourselves and could have continued to lag.
But I think we have to try to address it. I mean,
Well, we are.
Yeah,
I think
but to
we are
not
trying
do
to
it,
address but
to be afraid of what somebody else is going to do doesn't allow us to not do anything. So, we need to take those steps, and you're right. Think about down the line, what does that mean? Because as you say, the 3% does not catch us up this year, but we are taking a step, and then we'll continue to do that. And I think that's a different question than you raised about this balance of relying on real estate tax versus sales tax. And I can understand from a municipal funding standpoint that the real estate tax is less fickle than meals tax and sales tax, and so that's the reason to try to move that direction. But as I think the gentlemen have said, it's not something you do in one fell swoop. It will take some time, and certainly as we see what market conditions are with sales tax and lodging tax, we will find ourselves reacting to changes there. But we don't need to try to compensate somehow before we see those changes. We will have to react as we see those changes happening.
Yeah.
So,
I think just kind of picking on that and things that Mr. Allen and I have talked about numerous times is I mean, he's absolutely right. We have this sort of tension between the folks that we all talk to, that we all run into at grocery stores or otherwise, of that money's coming from those same individuals, and so you're hitting them multiple times. And so I think it's trying to strike a balance between I think it's important to continue to have this conversation about, I'm not saying we need to get to 60% of our general fund revenue coming from general property taxes, but at the same time, it's probably not 45%. It probably shouldn't be 45%. And if we were to defer that until we have a loss of revenue someplace else, it literally is. We all hate those politicians that say, well, let's not kick the can to the next generation. Well, this is sort of a crossroads. I think that I see this as an opportunity, while unpleasant, to look towards our future and what sort of future are we building for not only the folks that live here now, but the folks that want to come to our city, and try to strike a balance between property tax revenue and taking advantage of the mills, lodging, and sales tax revenue that we're still currently enjoying, recognizing that it's not going to stick around forever. So those are great points.
I mean, how long will people be able to afford the increases, though? Like, property tax, personal, utilities. I mean, I've stood in a payment line before, and just hearing people talk, like $1 is a lot to some people. And how many people, the percentage of people in Waynesboro who are struggling to pay that increase.
Right.
And over time, it's going to continue increasing. Like, at what point are we going to say, okay, we're going to cut it off right here for the next couple of years? But it's, to me, if I'm seeing this correctly, there's going to be an increase like every year. With most of our.
This is $1 million of new revenue in just the property taxes, but $700,000-800,000 of it come off the top to peripheral cost going up, completely unrelated. I mean, the fact that we're committing additional debt service to a prison population, and conversely doesn't go to support local K through 12 education in Waynesboro, is insulting to me. But it's also society. That's what exists. We put all this additional capacity and resources into services that seem counter to what you might expect in a society.
Well,
it's very frustrating.
The one meeting we was in talked about our tax rate compared to Stanton's, which is much higher. but I think you had the information that we fund more towards our students here than they do with a much
Local
higher.
contributions are about 45. Student populations are always different too. But yeah, so it's about $4,400, $4,500 locally, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, versus $44,000, $4,100 locally.
And you also brought up the fact that with this personal property, or not personal property, real estate tax that's going to kick in this time, it's going to hit a certain population of our city because the biggest part of it went to the homes that have a less value. So
Right.
with the chart that you showed, they're going to take the brunt of this tax increase.
Right. Yeah, that was a real eye-opener for me. So the majority of the impact, or the spread over the city, was 7%. There are parts of the community, particularly those that with home value of $80,000 to $120,000, that had spikes double, if not triple, that rate. So when the folks that are going to experience the full brunt of this rate increase, if we were to entertain, which we're not, but I don't think is any rate above that, you're just doubling down on those that have those entry-level homes, which we just can't do that.
I do think we share your concern about affordability in the community. And I can't speak to the circumstances of any individual household and how rate increases affect that household. But I can tell you that as you look objectively at the community as a whole, again, emphatically I state we're one of the most affordable cities in Virginia, and we're not one of the poorest. That I think if you have some perception that somehow we have an unusual burden here, it isn't borne out in any kind of statistical fact. And again, anecdotally, I realize that there are households in this community that will struggle and are struggling, and I'm not minimizing that. I'm simply saying as an objective look as your community as a whole, we have, we're towards the bottom in terms of taxes, and yet we're somewhere in the middle of the pack in terms of median income and poverty rates and that sort of thing. So, and in fact, in some of our recent borrowing with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, the last WQIF loan we did, we were no longer able to get 0% interest loans because our incomes were overly high. And relative to the water and sewer rates here, the income was fairly solid. And so, it's one of those things where we are reluctant. As I said earlier, we start our budget process with the assumption that you won't raise rates, that the council is going to be reluctant to do that because that's the natural assumption in government. And we only get to it when we think that we can't continue to provide the services that are required in the community without doing it. And that I don't find it acceptable, I don't get a sense that the council finds it acceptable, that we have the lowest paid teachers in the region, that we have the lowest paid police officers in the region, we have the lowest paid firemen, we have the lowest paid public work employees, we have the lowest paid administrators in the region, and that we're not making the same investments in our community that our neighbors are to be competitive, to try to advance the community in terms of economic development. And that the reality gets to be that we can only attract so much in terms of grants before we have to say we will bear the burden ourselves. As a community, we will bear the burden ourselves. And I realize that that's easy for me to say, hard for the council to do.
Do we have statistics on what our population is based on retired people?
We do.
Compared to other jurisdictions? Are we
We
higher?
do. And surprisingly, we're not as aging as a lot of Virginia communities. And part of it is that I think, and Mr. Jude actually did a study for us in the last year or so. We have a fair retired population, don't get me wrong, but we're not aging as quickly as the Commonwealth generally. And I think part of it is that we have a very affordable housing stock. And so when you have young people that are just starting out, starting families, that sort of thing, they can find a foothold here, and it helps drive your average age down. So you have families that are just starting out that are choosing to live in Waynesboro. Now, we suspect that some of those families, once they want to go to that second home, are going to Augusta County. But in terms of that preschool age population, in terms of average age, we're not aging as quickly, or at least the last statistic, we weren't aging as quickly as the rest of the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth, among states in the nation, is actually aging pretty rapidly.
Low birth rates. Virginia's year 5 into one of the highest states in the country in terms of outbound migration. So, when we're part of that mix, it's
And it's
More
difficult
good
to
news.
figure as well. I think the Commonwealth generally is regarded, we are favorably positioned relative to the nation's capital. We enjoy a lot of federal benefit in that regard. And so we're an affordable community in an affordable state. And again, it's not my place. I wouldn't presume to try to walk in your shoes. But I think there are elements that I would certainly communicate to folks who might question a recommendation that might say, you've enjoyed and continue to enjoy and would continue to enjoy a fairly affordable relative to peer cities existence, even if we enacted this. And I think that one of the things we're trying to suggest or assert even is that the operating expense of our operation remains fairly static. And I think Dr. Castle has sent a similar message relative to non-salary benefit expenses in the school system's budget. That element has remained fairly static. So your paid leadership, your executive management, your department directors are doing a fabulous job of holding down expenses that we can control. And a big message, part of this budget, is that the labor expense, which has been held low, probably needs some attention in order to preserve the health of your organization. And again, I would offer respectfully so that we can accomplish some of these things without creating an onerous or unbearable situation for most residents.
Mr. Mayor, do you have a sense of how you would like to spend your time at the budget work session we have scheduled next week?
I think I'd like to almost have some time to digest it myself, and I think if we all would appreciate that to learn. I can already tell you, there's going to be some things that we'll all hear right off of, well, looks like Parks and Rec is getting $160,000. They're the largest. I hear that every time, and so I'd like to be more informed. Again, as a thank you to staff and my colleagues on council, this has been a departure from at least my two previous budgets, and I have appreciated. I feel more informed about what's in there, even though I haven't flipped through the pages yet. Because I think it's what was our preamble, Jim, at one of our the first budget sessions was, a budget is a moral document. And so when we talked about values and our values as a community, that, we don't want to be a community that's known for having 70% of your job board at or below the Virginia poverty line for a family of 4. And that's where we were. Does this fix all of it? It doesn't, but it comes a long way. So, and I know those are important value statements as we sort of march in, but being mindful of, I think to Mr. Allen's point, of that classic tension that always exists of the folks that we serve and their ability to absorb these seismic shifts. So with that, would it be too much to ask my colleagues if we have our meeting next Monday, our regular business meeting, and sort of make a determination either prior to then or at that meeting as to whether it can convey the work session meeting on Tuesday? Would that work?
I think we
I'm
would
assuming we're going to convene the work session.
Okay.
And it's just a matter of what
topics?
you want your agenda to look like. As Mr. McCormick's mentioned, we think that if you take this approach to capital planning, that we would certainly advise, and in fact, Davenport Associates advised the council to develop stronger financial policies related to debt and capital plans. And so we would be certainly prepared to bring some ideas to you and to start to draft those policies. But we're mindful that it's your time and it's your budget at this point, so we want to do.
Well, I just want to make sure that folks have had enough time
Yeah.
to provide that feedback. So would it be too much to ask that perhaps by close of business Thursday, that we provide some emails of, hey, these are some topics that we'd like to maybe cover at our meeting Tuesday? Would that be?
I do, and I think particularly with the capital improvement plan, having some of that discussion would be important, because that sounds like a significant departure, and being this my first budget year, a lot of it is new, but it sounds like in general it's a change in how we're thinking about it. So I think that in particular would be valuable. But yeah, I think I can commit to Thursday.
Yeah, the capital program, I think, is not to overstate it, but exciting for me in that as I'm certain we have all done or will do, that when we talk about dollars, and while we're not going to know where every dollar is, maybe every 1,000 or every 10,000 might be nice, and we know where those dollars are pointing to, is that I can literally, if someone asks me, I can say, you got $350,000 of new revenue is going into a capital improvement plan to fund this, and that is an absolute departure. So, and I think I know if I were a citizen asking an elected representative of, what are you doing with all this money, to be able to point to it, I think is important. And I think the more that you can help us walk through that, I think helps in our ability to inform and respond to constituents.
Good point.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
It is.
Okay. Great. So COB Thursday, and maybe if you wouldn't mind sending out a little reminder tomorrow, that'd be great. Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you.
Anything else, folks? Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for joining us this evening. So,